You know, some stories don't just stay in the past. They have a way of revealing a kind of darkness that, well, it still echoes today. So today, we're going to unlock the gates of a place called Greystone Manor. It was a place where the search for knowledge got twisted into something truly horrific. And it all started with this one absolutely chilling phrase. It was found in a secret letter that showed up on the desk of a newspaper editor in Charleston. This was a desperate warning, you see, from someone who said they had just escaped an absolute nightmare. The writer called what was happening experiments upon human souls. I mean, a line like that, you can't just ignore it. So you have to imagine you're this editor, William Morrison. Of course, he was skeptical at first. I mean, false stories from abolitionists were pretty common back then, but this letter, which arrived in the fall of 1857, it just felt different. It was packed with specific, verifiable details that he just couldn't shake. And that's where our story really kicks off, with this one letter. This voice crying out from the shadows of a very remote, very private South Carolina plantation. So what was this letter about? Well, it was all about one place, Greystone Manor. We're talking about a massive 2,000-acre rice plantation. The owner, a man named Edmund Harrington, was incredibly wealthy from a very prominent family, but he was also a total recluse. He kept himself and his entire property wrapped in this thick blanket of secrecy. Now, here's what made this letter so powerful. It was credible. The sender, who only signed off as M. Washington, said she had escaped just the year before. And she wasn't speaking in vague terms. Oh no. She described specific, hidden spots, a secret room in the basement, something she called a silent house out near the swamp, and living quarters built way, way out, far from everyone else. These weren't just rumors. These were detailed eyewitness accounts. So you can imagine, Morrison was hooked. He started to dig, and as soon as he did, the whole story of Greystone Manor just started to come apart at the seams, revealing this pattern of strangeness that was just impossible to dismiss. Okay, so where do you start an investigation like this? Morrison went right to the public records. The 1850 census listed 63 enslaved people at Greystone. Now, for you and me, that's just a number. But for anyone who knew anything about rice plantations at the time, that was a huge red flag. For a property that size, 2,000 acres, only 63 people, that seems suspiciously low. And this is when things get really strange. The makeup of the population at Greystone was just completely off. If you look at a typical plantation, you'd see a lot of younger people, tons of kids. But at Greystone, a surprisingly high number of people were over 50, and there were almost no children. Even the records of births and deaths were spotty, which was unheard of for plantation owners who treated people like valuable inventory. Something was deeply, deeply wrong here. Then another letter arrived, and this was the piece of the puzzle Morrison desperately needed. It came from a man named James Crawford, who used to be an overseer at Greystone. He confirmed everything. He talked about those isolated quarters near the swamp, saying they were explicitly off limits. Harrington's excuse? Oh, the people there needed special supervision for some unspecified health conditions. Right. Crawford also remembered seeing bizarre supply orders for things like medical instruments and huge quantities of lime. Morrison's investigation started to uncover Harrington's own backstory, and it laid out this absolutely chilling timeline. Get this, he suddenly drops out of medical school in 1849, right after his professors shot down his ideas for unethical human experiments. Fast forward to 1854, he actually gets court permission to set up a private medical facility on his own property. A year after that, new people start arriving and are sent to those isolated quarters. And then in 1856, M. Washington runs for her life. The pattern here is, well, it's undeniable. And turns out, Harrington wasn't acting alone. He'd been writing back and forth with a Dr. Marcus Webb, a physician who had already been kicked out of his college for doing unauthorized experiments on poor patients in hospitals. In letters they later found, Webb actually called Greystone Manor an ideal location for their work. Chilling. So the paper trail was absolutely damning. But the whole truth was still locked up behind Greystone's gates. But then, in late 1857, those gates finally swung open, and Morrison's team got to step inside the horror. Here's the break in the case. Harrington got spooked. He put the entire plantation up for sale and just vanished, which gave Morrison the opening he needed. His team got onto the property, and they found exactly what Mr. Washington had described, a hidden door right in the pantry. And behind it wasn't a wine cellar, it was a laboratory. It was filled with surgical tools, restraining devices, and the most damning evidence of all, Harrington's own personal journals. And I mean, listen to this quote from one of those journals. It is just bone-chilling. This isn't the writing of a doctor. It's the writing of a cold, detached monster. People are just numbers. Subject, #17. He writes about applying, quote, progressive psychological pressure, and then clinically observing the permanence of behavioral changes. This was systematic, recorded torture written down in his own hand. But the horror didn't stop in the basement. Following M. Washington's letter, the investigators headed out toward the swamp. And there, right where she said it would be, they found it. A patch of disturbed, refilled soil where nothing was growing. When they began to excavate, they uncovered the plantation's final, most terrible secret. And the forensic evidence it was unambiguous. These weren't proper graves. They were dumping grounds. They found human remains with skulls that had been drilled with surgical precision, bones with cut marks from dissection, proof of systematic dismemberment. This was it. This was the ghastly proof of everything. So the story broke, and it shocked the nation. But, uncovering the crime, that was one thing. Actually getting justice, that was a whole different story. The aftermath reveals a completely different kind of horror, the silence of a system that was built to protect men like Harrington. I mean, this table really says it all. Edmund Harrington, the guy behind all of this horror, just ran off to Louisiana and was never caught. His accomplice, Dr. Webb, faced no criminal charges. And the two people who spoke out, James Crawford, the overseer, vanished. And M. Washington, the brave woman who started this whole thing, her fate is still unknown. Justice was completely, totally denied. So you have to ask yourself, why? How does that happen? Because the legal system back then offered zero protection. In fact, it was designed to do the exact opposite, to protect the property rights of slaveholders above everything else. The victims had no rights, no voice in a courtroom. The law itself was basically an accomplice to the crime. What went on at Greystone is just a textbook case of what we call systematic dehumanization. It's this process where you strip people of their humanity so completely that they become objects. They weren't people to Harrington and Webb. They were just subjects. And their medical knowledge wasn't a tool for healing. It was an instrument for absolute power and torture. So this whole story, it just forces you to ask this really tough question. The events were exposed. The evidence was crystal clear. So how is a history this horrific ultimately silenced? Well, here's how. If you go to the site where Greystone Manor used to be today, you'll find a historical marker, but it doesn't say a word about experiments or torture or unmarked graves. No, it talks about rice cultivation and antebellum architecture. The horror has been completely, deliberately erased from the official story. I mean, just think about that for a second. Washington risked everything, her freedom, her life, to break that silence. And today, that very same silence is being carefully maintained by a simple, state-approved plaque. It's an active, ongoing process of forgetting. So I'll just leave you with this question to think about. What is the true legacy of Greystone Manor? Is it the chilling power of an institution to just bury its own crimes? Or is it the incredible, extraordinary courage of that one single voice that, against all odds, absolutely refused to be silenced?